Hi, I'm Ben Duquette, and today I'm going to be talking to you about change control, specifically within the context of deploying an enterprise software system. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about me. I graduated from the University of Arizona, and at the time, it was actually one of the very few programs that offered an undergrad degree in engineering management. So that's what I studied. I graduated in 2008 and became an engineering software consultant, not to be confused with a software engineer. I don't do any programming, but rather I provide consulting services specifically around a very specific kind of engineering software that we'll talk about during this presentation. For about the last 2.5 years, I've actually been at Bose, a little outside of Boston. If you're not familiar with Bose, they do all sorts of audio equipment from headphones and surround sound speakers, Bluetooth speakers, car speakers, etc. When I started there, I was part of the verification and validation team regarding this project. Eventually, I moved on to lead the data migration team. And since we've gone live, I actually transitioned over to a business systems analyst role regarding this software. So just to give you a little bit of a project background, one of the main goals we had was to move from multiple data management systems to a single one. There's a lot of cost savings here, not just from a licensing and maintenance perspective, but also for user productivity. If you only have to look at one system to find what you're looking for, it's going to make it a lot easier, a lot quicker. So if you look at the left-hand side of that graphic, we had several different systems. Obviously, people had data on network drives. We had a tool called Teamcenter, which people used to manage their NX CAD data. We had a system called Foundation. Both of those two were internal, and then we had Project Link. Project Link was an external system hosted by a third party. We used it to collaborate and share documents with vendors and people outside of Bose. So we're trying to take all of those and move them over to a new tool called Windchill, which is a software service provided by a company called PTC. Now, you might be wondering, well, why don't they just use something like SharePoint? If you're not familiar with the whole CAD world, there's a lot of complex relationships with that data. You create a bunch of parts, you combine them into an assembly, you make a drawing, and SharePoint can't handle that. It more manages flat files, so that's where a tool like Windchill really excels. Now, in addition to the data migration aspect of the project, there was an entire development team that was focused on programming the business rules, the workflows that matched up to some of the business processes that Bose has, other custom functionality, user interface enhancements, and of course fixing any bugs that we found. Now, I'm going to talk about two parts of change control. The first one's quality control. How did we make sure we delivered, from a development team perspective, a high quality solution to the end user? And so one of the keys here was we used an Agile Scrum framework. If you're not familiar with that, instead of doing an approach where you do gather all the requirements, do all the development work, and finally deliver the end result to the customer, this is much more incremental. So we just do bits and pieces, cut it down into little stories, and we deliver that to the customer. And that way, if they don't like something, if there's a problem, there's a change, and I think we all know in a project, there's always changes. This way it makes it much easier to adapt because you're constantly working, getting the results in front of the customer, and adapting to them. So we would deliver a sprint every 4 weeks. Each activity or each story within a sprint was documented in a functional specification, just to make sure that we had a record and that everyone approved of it. And then there was also a link to a related test script in case anyone wanted to test the functionality and see if it was working as intended. As far as the sprints themselves, they're prioritized by a product owner. That's just a role that we have in the Scrum world. It's somebody who works very closely with the business to figure out what their needs are and which needs have the most value. And so they kind of coordinate between the business and the Scrum team. Now, as the Scrum team did their development work, they would also test it, and that includes not just testing those new functionality, but also regression testing, make sure that they didn't interfere with anything that they had done in the past. Finally, we would deploy it to a quality system where the business representatives also did a full round of testing. Now, one thing I do want to point out, if these people did find defects, we didn't necessarily fix them at the time. Again, with Scrum, it's all about delivering some value within a sprint and continuing on to the next one. Well, instead, we took these defects, we logged them, and they might come up in a future sprint, but we didn't take the time to necessarily fix them right then and there. As far as how the development team worked, they were using a system called Jira. And some people, if you are familiar with Scrum, they might use a whiteboard and they might move Post-its kind of across the whiteboard. Since some of our team was actually offshore in India, it was much more important for us to use this web-based solution. We were able to see what people are working on. You can link to your test scripts, store the functional specs, collaborate with each other, and it made it very easy to use and make sure that everyone was on the same page and we were delivering the quality that we expected to. Now, the other part of change control, and this is probably what people most think about, and that's scope control. Making sure that any big changes are going to go through a proper approval process and we're not constantly making changes to the requirements or changes to the solution. So once the development team had met all core requirements, at that point we kind of put a freeze in place and we said, okay, any major changes from that point forward had to be approved by our change control board. And at the same time, the development team instead turned their focus from those core requirements to fixing the issues that we had just talked about that had come up in testing. Now, it might not have been just any old issue from their own development work. It could also be an issue just with the out-of-the-box software itself, if it doesn't quite work as intended or how we expected it to from the software provider. This is also, again, done in a sprint fashion. So the product owner would look through all the defects, prioritize them, and we would start working on the sprint. Now, once we were down to this point, it was much easier to see how much work was left, and we were able to set a go-live date for our project. At that point, all of the code was frozen. This was actually done 3 months prior to go-live, so no more changes were allowed. And this would give us time to do another full round of testing, do a rehearsal go-live, and of course, then we would come up with our production go-live. Now, during this last full round of testing, if any what we call blocker issues were found, and that basically means we cannot go live with this problem, then it would go to the change control board and they would have to look exactly what the problem was, what the impact was, are there any workarounds, and if what we were going to do with it, are we going to stop and change the go live date, or if we were going to work on this problem, somehow introduce it into the code and then do more testing. Now, it is important that I note that when we went live, that wasn't going to be the final solution. Again, we were using this Agile Scrum methodology, so any other critical issues, it didn't mean we were ignoring them, it just meant they were going to get fixed in the future. So the real determination here was, can we go live? Can people actually work with this problem or not? We took care of all the critical ones after go live. This project didn't finish when we went live. Now, as far as the change control board, you can see exactly who made that up on this slide here. This is kind of a simplified version of the project team. You can see the project manager, the product owner, and the Scrum team that we've spoken about. Then there was also these track leads, basically people who were heading up a track on whether it was visualization, change management, document management, CAD data management, etc. They each had their own track. They worked very closely with the business to gather requirements, and then they had some team members. But the change control board itself, it was made up of the project manager, product owner, and track leads. Occasionally, we had some of the steering committees sit in, but for the most part, those were our core members. So just to summarize, again, this was a very large, very complex project. It actually took 3 years until we went live, and that consisted of 21 sprints. As I mentioned before, the project didn't end. That development team is still in place. We're actually working on Sprint 32 right now, still trying to deliver value, whether it's new functionality or continuing to fix issues that occasionally spring up. We actually did deliver a very high quality solution. We had a lot of people on staff ready to help at go live, and it was surprisingly quiet. So, we were all very happy with how that went. And from a scope perspective, the executives were really looking at, did we come under the timeline? Did we come in within budget? And the answer to both of those were yes. And so, both quality and scope-wise, it was because of this change control process that we had in place, and that was truly critical to the project's success. That's all that I have for you guys. I'm going to go ahead and take any questions now.